Welcome to February's first Thursday. My presentation today switches from the spiritual narratives that we've looked at the first two sessions to an earlier section of the book on giving my word, which are identified as personal narratives. These narratives are essentially confessional offerings. There is among them a number that are love poems from which I would read, prompted, as it were, by the approach of Valentine's Day. I referred to these over the years as Jane songs, Jane being my spouse. They can be found in my earlier collection of poems, Making Myself a Word, as well as in this new collection on Giving My Word. Let me begin by reading from page 60, a poem that is entitled A Short Jane Song. When Dante encounters Beatrice in the 30th canto of Purgatorio, he inquires how she was, to which she replied, "We are fine. Already with you, my dear, I have begun to be that we." Charles Williams, a friend of C.S. Lewis and a fellow Inkling, was quite interested in the effect that Dante's brief encounter with Beatrice had had on his life. It was part of his larger argument that the romantic metaphor had been lost in post-medieval Christianity to its great detriment. He insisted that Beatrice's line was to be counted as one of the truly great moments in poetry. I had only to apply it to Jane in order for it to signify the tectonic shift in my own destiny. It might seem odd to place such love poems in a book which purports to be a narrative that runs from the original silence to a final silence, literally a cosmic narrative. But I would argue that these romances are an essential part of that narrative. Any disassociation of the senses from the works of the mind is a fundamental error. This is precisely one of the things that the 17th century mystical poets in England intended to attack. At their head was John Donne, that English courtier turned cleric, famous for preaching from the pulpit of St. Paul's in London. His final sermon, wrapped in his own uh, uh, binding cloth. His poems range from poems to his beloved Anne Moore to his spiritual poems addressed to his holy God. Here is the ending of one of the late poems of his that he is entitled A Hymn to God the Father. I have a sin of fear that when I have spun my last thread, I shall perish on the shore. Swear by thyself that at my death thy sun shall shine as it shines now and hithertofore. And having done that thou hast done, I have no more. Donne's critics, early and late, have a habit of separating his poems between those of his lustful youth and those of his dour maturity. But in actuality, they are more mixed, and he himself never attempted to separate them. The love of Anne clarifies his love of God and vice versa. The love of the former is not just physical, but is also spiritual And the love of the latter is not just spiritual, it is also physical, filled with eros, filled with the feelings of the heart. This is no idiosyncrasy on the part of Donne. It can be found in a number of his contemporaries. I think of John of the Cross, the Spanish Carmelite, just slightly before his time, who makes use of the romantic metaphor in writing about his relationship with God. From his treatment on mysticism, The Ascent to Mount Carmel, you'll find that famous poem of his. One dark night, fired with love's urgent longings, ah, sheer grace! I went out unseen, my house being now all stilled. This guided me more surely than the light of the noon to where he waited for me, him I knew so well, in a place where no one appeared. John of the Cross, in his poetry, explores the nature of the mystical experience by means of a poetic metaphor of a Romeo escaping the worldliness of his family to encounter his Juliet, his beloved. Both Johns have been important mentors for me in the earliest moments, from the earliest moments of my formation as a priest, which explains in part why, in the end, I've turned to verse, if ever so inferior to theirs. Here's another example from On Giving My Word. It's entitled The End of Faithfulness, Comedy, Tragedy, or Grace. It can be found on page 57. Early I vowed faithfulness and held it between me and my God until it was claimed in part by Jane. In the noon of my days, when my libido ran full flood, it was my pride that somehow it held with that Jane too. But in the back of my mind, there lurked a fear that somehow with time my pride would break and my libido would carry me off to the comic fate of a monk, mocked and hampered Falstaff. Or else my libido would break, and left to my pride, I would rail against my offspring and come to that tragic fate of a reviled and outcast Lear. Now, at the edge of the dark, it would appear that by some stroke of luck, both broke on the same day. And in my end, I am left with faithfulness. And pondering the conundrum that my life has accomplished neither great comedy nor high tragedy, indeed nothing more than grace. Thank God. Go on in page 61 and we'll find another short poem, a series of short poems actually. Let us go off. Yes, let us go off to sleep in some distant wildly deep, under some other sun, far from the race we've run. A dark wood. That, of course, has a resonance with Dante because the whole Divine Comedy begins with his waking up in a dark wood. I am left pondering what has turned this on, after a dormant bell that seemed by mutual consent the way it would be. Is it something that we have left behind? Or is it something we sense to be ahead, that this has come back to our bed? On page 64, a priest in an opera of grace. He sings to the mirror of his ideal self. It is ill-defined and subject to change, it having come to him from his father, not without an element of misogyny, and comically it mocks him. He sings to the woman who loves him. In her he sees his real self, ever more defined and lined with the passage of time, and she gracefully humbles him. If you actually have come to the end of my book, or if you're one of those people that peek to the last chapter, you'll find there that I make the claim that I'm ready for silence. And more or less, I promised Job to heed his advice, which goes, I would you now keep silence, that would be your wisdom. Nevertheless, I don't seem to be able to stop. Here is a poem that was prompted by the preparation for this talk. Thanks to John Donne. My love life, as in how's your love life doing, has turned out remarkably well for someone who was retarded and inept. Late in my 20s, it was undone. Then, in a surprising and effortless way, it was done. I think in part because by then my faith life had become a love life, as in beloved by God. So loving another was easy, and faith, as it turned out, followed. Now, at this last time, it seems as if one or the other of us will be carried off. But I know that however that comes about, we will not be undone, for faith has said it will not be so. As a last poem in our presentation today, I would refer again to John Donne and a curious poem he called A Valediction of a Book. That is, a praise for a certain book. Remember that John married Mary Ann Moore without permission and consequently lost his job as secretary to Sir Thomas Egerton, the keeper of the Great Seal and the Lord High Chancellor, and in effect, his career at court, angering, as it were, destiny itself. In the poem, he addresses Anne, my dear love, gives her directions on what to do, and refers to destiny as that which has escaped him or holding out on him. That kind of old English phrase, elogen me. It helps to remember as we go through this poem that the education of a young man like John Donne at Oxford would have included reading a lot of Greek and Latin poetry. And in fact, going through exercises where you had to write Latin poetry and Greek poetry. I will tell thee now, dear love, what you shalt do, to anger destiny as she does us. How I will say, though she alones me thus, and how prosperity shall know it too, how thine may out endure Sibyl's glory and obscure, her who from Pindar could allure, and her through help Lucan is not lame, and her whose book, they say, Homer did find and name. Study our manuscripts, those myriads of letters, which have passed twixt thee and me. Thence write our annals, and in them be To all whom love's sublime fire invades, rule and example found. They're the faith of any ground, no schismatic will dare to wound. That sees how love this grace to us affords, to make, to keep, to use, to be these his records. This book, as long lived as the elements, or as the world's form, this all grave tome in cipher writ, or new made idiom, we, for love's clergy only, are its instruments. When this book was made thus, should again this ravenous vandals and goths inundate us, learning we're safe. In this our universe, schools might learn science, spheres music, angels verse. In fact, Donne continues to argue that the divines, the lawyers, the statesmen, each could recover after such a traumatic experience as a dark age again, their science from the compendium of these love letters. The cheek to suggest that, but one does love it. Our next First Thursday will fall on the 2nd of March, and in it I will continue to read and discuss material from the chapter on personal narratives. We'll take a first look at an aphorism, aphorism 15, and we'll discuss the interplay of the poems that follow. Our theme will continue to be on the rather importance of the small matters of individual stories as an essential part of the one great story, the cosmic narrative. Good evening.